An ancient burial shroud, full of secrets. It has come a long way from a tomb in Egypt to a museum in Moscow. Today, modern technologies will help us take a nearly 2,000-year journey to unravel some of its mysteries. Second century AD. Fertile Egypt is a Roman province. At that time, the traditions of the funeral cult were as strong as ever. Embalming, mummification, entombment, burial. The ancient rituals were well respected. For ancient Egyptians, earthly life was just a way of preparation for rebirth after death. One of the most important parts of the ritual was making a sarcophagus and purchasing all of the necessary items. One such item for a woman who once lived under the hot Egyptian sun was our very burial shroud. Let's trace its path on the way to the customer. Its journey began in the fields of flax, which ran along the sandy banks of the Nile. Flax was the main material for textiles in Egypt and was considered a gift from the gods. It grows exceptionally quickly. Planted in the spring, it was harvested in the summer. The plants were pulled out of the soil with the roots. Then they were cleaned, soaked, and boiled. To extract the bast fibers from the stem, the plants would be kneaded and beaten. Then the bundles of fibers were separated and tied together. After that, the fibers were twisted together to form a strong thread.
Тканое полотно было известно в Египте с 5-го тысячелетия до нашей эры. К этому времени относятся и первые изображения.
Woven fabrics were known in Egypt from the 5th millennium BC. The first image of a loom is attributed to that date. At first, the looms were horizontal, with wooden mounts for the coil and the cylinder. Vertical looms have been known in Egypt since the New Kingdom. Fabric made this way could be very high quality. It was used both to clothe the living and to bury the dead. Both bandages for mummies and burial shrouds were made of linen, and our shroud is no exception. And now, as the fabric for the shroud is ready, the process of making an image has begun. Burial shrouds were mass-produced in Egypt. To use their time more efficiently, the artist would create most of the image, such as the figures of the gods, the body of the deceased, and the decorations, beforehand, leaving an empty spot in the area where the face should be placed. The portrait was made separately, and when the time came, put on the finished shroud. So what do these inserted faces tell us? Of course, the general opinion is that the portraits would be made when a person was still alive, and then placed on the shroud when needed. But it's also impossible to prove. There is another theory. Maybe the shrouds were reused and the portraits replaced. We have an example of a portrait where we have only the face, but not the body. Maybe the portraits were reused within one family, for example. The fabric of the shroud was treated with an adhesive solution. The same adhesives were used to mix the paints. These would be either protein-based or carbohydrate-based. Bone glue was also used for our shroud. The bone glue was made by boiling animal bones, skin, tendons, and ligaments. By mixing it with different pigments, ancient Egyptians could make paints. There were a few options in terms of pigments and adhesives at that time. The first mention of materials and painting techniques can be found in Theophrastus's writings in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC, as well as the Greek physician Dioscorides in the 1st century AD, and Pliny's texts in the 1st century AD. The image on our shroud was also made with only a few pigments. Fine gypsum powder was used as a white pigment. The yellow paint was made with Auri pigment. Natural Auri pigment, or golden paint, made a beautiful yellow color with a golden hue and was widely popular in Egypt. It can be found in painted Egyptian masks and the sarcophagi of the 7th century BC. The blue pigment used for the shroud is called indigo. This natural pigment can be extracted from several types of plants. The pigment was obtained in a process of artificially fermenting the dye contained in the plant and turning it into a powder. As a red pigment, ancient Egyptians used ochre. It's a natural pigment that it contains a lot of iron. Deep red ochre could be found in several areas in Egypt. But there were also precedents of using burnt yellow ochre in the absence of the red one. The other colors which can be seen on the shroud were made by mixing the pigments we mentioned before. The fabric and the paints are both ready, and now it is time to make the image. With special flat paintbrushes made of fibrous wood, the artist painted Anubis and Osiris, surrounded by their servants from the afterlife, and between them a figure of a woman, ready to leave her earthly life behind. We don't know for sure whether the shroud had already been in the family of the deceased or if it was bought for her. But we do know that the next step was putting her portrait onto the shroud. The portrait piece was also made on linen fabric and glued onto the shroud with bone glue. Concerning the portrait piece, it was made with the same pigments and adhesives used for the rest of the shroud. Animal glue was used to affix it onto the base. But the most mysterious part came only after that. For some reason, an image of a child holding a woman's hand was added to the shroud later on. It was done after the shroud had been finished. There were a lot of suggestions. The natural assumption would be that the mother and the child died at the same time, wouldn't it? But then it turned out that no. The woman's figure was depicted first, and the image of the child was added later. So, such an assumption did exist, and by the way, it is interesting to know that it was confirmed. It was confirmed by a recent study. Photographs were taken when the restoration process began, and then after they were analyzed. It was confirmed that initially it was just a single portrait, a common three-figure composition, and then all of a sudden there was this child added to it. We can only guess why this happened. It is believed that the woman was gone before the child. Maybe both died as a result of some epidemic. Who knows?
Сюжет, связанный с пеленой, который хранится сейчас в Пушкинском музее, как раз отражает эти трагические события. Так это или не так, наверное, до конца мы не можем уверены быть.
I think that the story behind the shroud from the museum's collection reflects those tragic events. We probably will never be able to be completely sure whether it's true or not, though. But then again, looking over the canvas of history, we can only say that the family who lost the mother and the child at the same time decided to bury them together for some moral reasons. And since it is unprecedented, and there are no cases of similar family burials, I think this is the most likely explanation.
Самое верное объяснение. И говорить
I think it's uncalled for to talk about someone burying two people in one sarcophagus together, just to save money.
мне кажется, не стоит.
После демонтажа портрета женщины был
When the portrait piece was taken off the base, an old paint layer was found underneath. It allows us to assume that there used to be an image of another woman at some point. Most likely the shroud was reused, and this partially explains the fact that the image of the boy was added much later.
объяснить тот факт,
However it may be, this secret is still well kept by the shroud.
остальных фигур на беременности.
Be that as it may, the shroud accompanied the deceased on her last journey to the underworld, and for a very long time it stayed with her in a tomb. And many years later it saw the light of day again. Similar to many other ancient Egyptian artifacts, it was found during archaeological excavation works. After years spent in the tomb and then perhaps being neglected, it was badly damaged. We do not know for sure where the shroud was found. However, we do know that many excavations were performed illegally in the 19th century. The portraits found in tombs were often thrown away as useless. Who knows where and how the shroud was stored before it got to the Russian Egyptologist Vladimir Golenishev. Thanks to extensive research, it was established that the shroud was restored in the 19th century. It was fixed onto a new base, stretched on a frame, and put under glass. The 19th century masters did perform some retouches, but in 100 years following that restoration, as a result of natural aging, the adhesive has lost its plasticity, and the linen threads have become hard and fragile. One way or another, the shroud was sold and became a part of Vladimir Golenishev's collection. Now it belongs to the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts. Our shroud has come a long way from the flax fields in torrid Egypt of the 2nd century AD to one of the major museums of modern-day Moscow. And what will the future bring? More research, and after that a further restoration. How it will proceed and what its results will be, you may discover in the next episodes of our series.